Fire chiefs say Saturday is looming as one of the worst days for bushfires in living memory.
Gale force winds are expected to accompany the extreme heat.
The horror weekend ahead, with the mercury predicted to top the 40s again on Saturday.
Fire authorities are warning the public to prepare for the worst.
Stinking hot day. It was 40-something degrees at 6 o'clock in the morning. And I got up at 6 o'clock and started putting sprinklers on the shed, which I've been meaning to do for the last 10 years.
Steve Pascoe lives in the tiny community of Strathewen, just north of Melbourne. And he's talking about the 7th of February 2009, known in Victoria as Black Saturday. Steve's worked in emergency management and bushfire education, and he doesn't need the fire chiefs or even the Bureau to tell him it's a bad fire weather day.
My daughter Jess, who was 24 at the time, was home with us. That was part of our plan, was everyone's home. Live together, die together was my motto.
Bushfire and its impact is the causal bedrock of this podcast, and we'll continue with Steve's story about Black Saturday in a moment. But I want to explain that our focus for this series is not the heat of the moment, the theatre of emergency, the drama of the disaster. It's not even the heady days and weeks afterwards when life is like a spin dryer and even daylight is not in the right place. Our exploration will be on the cold charcoal, the reweaving of the tatters of life, the glacial, painstaking work that unfolds over months and years and moves a community and a system and a politics towards that shape-shifting concept we call recovery.
There was 4 or 5 of us, and we all had experience in government, we all had experience in communities. And we knew the upsides and downsides of both of those.
It's a week or two after the fires, and conversations are starting amongst a small group of active Strathewen community members. It's Steve's next comment that really shocks me.
We got together and said, yes, we need to get going. We need to bring our community together. We need to connect. We need to start talking about how we manage ourselves, and we need to get ahead of government because they're going to bugger us up if we don't.
This is a tiny community, less than 45 kilometres from a city of millions, in a wealthy Western country, living in a blackened landscape with homes and buildings destroyed. People are dead, and the citizens who live there with experience in government feel they can't rely on the institutions with responsibility to do what is needed.
We started thinking about we need a group that is authorised to make decisions. That needs to be formal. It needs to have some protections. It needs to be...
Steve's talking here about citizenship and participation. He's talking about governance and government. He's talking about democracy. This is Democracy After Disaster, a podcast about power and money and how communities recovering from bushfire or any disaster need to be empowered in their recovery if they're not to be further harmed by the system meant to help them. My name's Kate Lawrence, and across 9 episodes we'll hear stories from Macedon to Malakuta. We'll look at events and concepts and structures. We'll talk to experts in history and philosophy and political science. And we'll uncover exciting, effective and very human ways we can dramatically improve our collective recovery. To begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and waters, oceans and cosmos of the places we'll travel to in this podcast. Places that have not been ceded or sold, places that have been devastated by the bushfires we hear about. I want to recognise that the destruction of natural disaster has a unique and profound impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people because of their deep and sacred connection to country, as well as the ongoing impacts of colonisation. Secondly, I want to introduce myself and begin to explain how I arrived here making this podcast. Like Steve and many others you'll hear, not only do I live in the high bushfire risk area of Macedon, but I too have my issues with authority. In the mid-80s, I was sitting in a lecture theatre at the Australian National University with Professor Gregg talking about contracts law. He was carefully explaining the concept of judicial objectivity.
Is the idea that judges should be impartial and not influenced by personal feelings or opinions when considering and representing facts.
I'd only been a law student for a few weeks, but this sounded like self-serving bollocks to me. How could these learned men, which they mostly were, men that is, I can't vouch for their learnedness, be sitting in judgment without being influenced by their personal beliefs or political worldviews? I mean, if they were, how could two supposedly great and objective judicial minds reach opposing conclusions about the exact same objective facts? This realisation did not, however, see me walking out the door of law school never to return. No, the prestige of lawyer shone like a beacon on a hill, which I justified with the seductive thinking that I would change the system once I was in it. So I made the transition from student to lawyer, but as I worked in community law, I became more sceptical about the legal system, not less. I felt like a cog in the big machine, enabling it to function, not changing it. While I had voice and authority, it was usually at the expense of my clients' silence. Unfair systems of power seem to be everywhere, in politics, in land and money ownership, in access to knowledge, and in the entrenched power imbalances built on gender, race, and class. And it seemed the more equality was given lip service by the world, the more the systems of power dug in their heels to perpetuate the dominating regime. The tension between the privilege I had as a lawyer and the championing of equality and human rights has left me as confused and hypocritical as the world around me. Eventually I left the law and I left the city to live in a forest at the base of a mountain beside the headwaters of a river. And I found myself living, then working, in a landscape and a community at risk of bushfire. And I started to see how, for the most part, our political system corrals and controls the voice and agency of communities generally, and particularly in their recovery from disaster, and how damaging this is. With natural disasters increasing year on year and traumas compounding, we need new ideas for how governments share power, for how communities can be strengthened, for how democracy works in the wake of a disaster. These 9 episodes are a big, sprawling mashup of ideas and stories which, for the most part, have defied neat shaping and raise more questions than answers. It was Einstein who said if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about solutions. So in this series, the first 6 episodes introduce us to people and places, context and experience, and problems. And the last 3 episodes are more conceptual and focus on ideas, tools and solutions for how we can embody democracy in our communities and institutions after a disaster. Like most human endeavours, there is no magic formula, no one right way. We need to share our experiences, hear what worked and what didn't, and think and talk and practice and deliberate if we are to hold together for what's coming. But first, it helps to have some sense of what it's like to live through a disaster. So on a glorious day in late spring, I drove almost due east across the rural edge of Melbourne from one high bushfire risk area to another. Strathewen's a tiny district of rolling green and treed hills in the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung-speaking people of the Kulin Nation. It sits at the base of an escarpment that climbs 250 metres straight up to the Kinglake Ranges. It's more hamlet than town, with a school, a hall, a fire station and not much else. I came in the back way, down a steep spur of that escarpment, through forest still recovering from the fires over a decade before. The road was skittish dirt, and I fought to look straight ahead and not at the steep sides I might slide off. Steve and I chewed the fat about roads and weeds and weather, with Tess the dog adding in her 2 bobs worth every so often.
There's another one which goes up under the power lines.
Ah, okay.
Switchbacks all the way back.
Right.
And so that's kind of exciting, particularly if you've got a trailer on or something like.
No, not exciting.
And then we settled in and talked about the 7th of February 2009. So that's a heads up. This next part is about the experience of the Black Saturday bushfires. So please take care while listening.
So Jess was home and she went about doing a whole bunch of things that were in the planning, filling a bath with water, putting the towels in, sealing around doors, picking things up from the verandas and throwing them out on the lawn, all those sort of things. I wasn't panicked. We've got a local phone tree, did a ring around. The information that was on the web and on the radio and everything else didn't change from the fire being at East Kilmore. It was never updated. I had a CFA radio scanner and could hear, when it got to Whittlesea, I knew we were in trouble. Started hearing the radio calls Whittlesea, and then some small spot fires down the road here. Oh, that's important that gets put out, and that got put out. Oh, it's okay. Didn't realise that there was a massive fire burning this way. We just thought it was spot fires. It got into our valley at 4:30. There was a Mayday call came through from a couple of fire trucks in Whittlesea, and that blew my mind. Still does. Sorry. Moment to set it. I thought people were dying, listening to people dying, yeah. So for when that happened, I just couldn't talk. Adrenaline choked me off and really set me going. Yeah, until it didn't. But that lasted for 5, maybe 10 minutes, and then everything washed off and I was perfectly calm and quite clear, really. It was amazing. It was quite dark at that stage. It wasn't completely black, but these bright yellow flames leaping up the mountain there. I just want to take photos of this beautiful stuff happening on the mountain. People are dying and this is going to go to shit in a bad way. And I'm just going, geez, look at that. More spot fires burned up the paddock at the back of us here. Watch that. That's interesting. Had sprinklers out around the lawn, which weren't doing anything. My daughter, Jess, had the horses on the back veranda at that stage with sprinklers going over them. We'd brought the ponies inside the house. The big horses wouldn't come through the door, unfortunately, so they didn't survive. So we moved closer and closer to the house, and as the fire came up the hill and was burning garden, we came back inside the house and secured the house and just worked around looking for embers and all the usual stuff. Completely black at that stage, couldn't see a thing. My wife was holding the ponies. We had big double glazed windows that looked out towards Mount Sugarloaf, and my wife was holding the 2 ponies. Oh, emotional moment again. This goes on for a long time, you know. Holding the 2 ponies, big window, Japanese maple flaring off, just like that, and this perfect silhouette of a wife and a horse against this flame background was beautiful. At one stage, I was walking around the house and we had a steep pitched roof, cathedral ceiling, and embers were falling down from the ridge beam. And I looked at that and went, okay, so that's a problem. Went out the back door, grabbed the hose to squirt some water at that and put it out, and there was no water. So the pumps had stopped, or the hoses had burnt, or the pipes had burnt, so there was no water. Okay, so I'm not going to put that out. We're going to lose the house. We grabbed the 2 dogs, got the blankets out of the bathtub and the towels out of the bathtub, and tripping over a pile of horse poo in the middle of the dining room. So we moved outside. I knew which way the fire was coming from, so we were on the sheltered side of the house. And we had a sort of an internal corner on an outside laundry. Little corner there. Jess and Ellie ducked in there, covered in a blanket with the 2 dogs. And I wandered backwards and forwards up the veranda, just keeping an eye on things, throwing buckets of water at things every now and then when I thought I needed something to do. And then the wind changed again. And so that was coming straight into the corner we were nestled in. So we got up from that corner and moved around to the other side of the house, which was then on the lee side. Wind changed again, came to the north and forced us around to the front of the house, which was then sheltered. I was the other way around now. I was looking into the inside of the house burning, looking up at the dormer windows with the flames pouring out of them. And it was all just academic at that stage. It was, gee, that's interesting. I can remember that when we were sitting outside the house at that last moment, seeing wind coming past the end of the house that I remember as being bright red, not compatible with life. There was a bit of a lull. Okay, we need to be somewhere. The house is burning down. This is not a good place to be anymore. Looked around. We had the veggie garden, which was still green. The lettuces were still green, but the fences were burning. There was wire and all sorts of things to get through to get there. Big concrete tank that's 8 foot deep, and I thought, well, that'll work. We can get into it. I'm not sure we're going to get out of it. And then looked up the hill, and we had an old above-ground swimming pool that I'd been pumping dam water to for 20 years for the garden. It had about 2 foot of water in it and about 1 foot of mud. The sides were too hot to touch. The plastic had melted down to the waterline, so just threw the girls over and then cleared the 4 foot sides in a single bound myself, which I've never done before or ever done since. And shortly after that, the plastic liner gave up and all the water had drained out. And so we just snuggled down in amongst the foot of mud that was left in the bottom and stayed there. And it was about a bit after that the wind change came through from the southwest. It blew the roof off the house and into the backyard and blew the side of the above-ground pool over on top of us, which turned out to be perfect because then the wind just went straight over the top of us and we were tucked down in this little cocoon and snuggled down into the mud and we just, you okay? It was all fine. Time after that, maybe 20, 30 minutes, the wind died, the smoke disappeared, the sun came out, and I reckon this is 6:30, something like that.
Let's go to Kieran Walsh, the Deputy Commissioner of Victoria Police.
As of 9:45 this evening, we can confirm 14 deceased.
But at 9:45 that night, no one had any idea of the extent of the devastation or the number of people who'd lost their lives.
Well, police say the death toll is certain to increase. Just this morning, another 15 bodies were identified, pushing the death toll to 108.
It would take 2 months for the final number of deaths from the fires to be established at 173. And in Strathewen?
The small town of Strathewen, northeast of Melbourne, was wiped out on Black Saturday. 27 of its 200 or so residents were killed.
March was a month of funerals. It was almost too hard to participate in. We've had to hold off, keep a distance just to protect ourselves. It was such a bad month that we actually had to, we'd start at the start of the week on Sunday, we'd say, so whose funerals have we got this week? Now there's 2 on Thursday morning, 1 on Friday afternoon, there's 3 on Wednesday. You go to that one on Wednesday morning, I'll go to that one Wednesday afternoon, we'll split them up, and it's terrible. And because there was so much, we couldn't focus on the individuals. But those who were left were part of a group of people we had to care for. The really close people who died, I don't think I've thought about it because it's too hard. I'm thinking about it's not going to make it any better and not going to bring them back and all of those things, and it might pop up sometime, but it's just there.
The heartbreak and trauma that this day seared into the minds of tens of thousands of Victorians is unfathomable. Both those who lived in the path of the fire and those who volunteered and worked as firefighters, police, ambulance, SES, Red Cross, council workers, and on and on. The mental, emotional and physical toll endures, often for decades. In Victoria, the political fallout from the Black Saturday fires was deep and far-reaching. The recriminations were bitter. The coals of the day were raked over with the fine-tooth comb of forensic science and law. The reactions, the options, the causes and the future were the subject of endless discussion, argument, opinions and decisions. And while there were many themes and policies and procedures being questioned, the one that stood out most starkly was the issue of warnings. A year after the fires, the ABC Four Corners broadcast a brilliant and extraordinary 2.5-hour documentary called After the Firestorm, made by journalist Jacob Hickey. Here are some excerpts giving an overview of the fire that burnt Strathewen and highlighting some of the issues relating to warnings.
Saturday, February the 7th, 2009. Temperatures have been soaring above 40 degrees for days. Now the winds are rising. Mid-morning in Melbourne, and senior firefighters are gathering. They're studying the Fire Danger Index. It measures the risk of a bushfire on a scale of 0 to 100. Today the index is peaking close to 200. An hour's drive north of Melbourne, 60 km/h winds tear down power lines at Kilmore East. A fire ignites.
Kevin from Kilmore East had just phoned. Hi Kevin, which fire are you? You're the Wandong,
the Kilmore East Wandong fire, but it started about 500 metres from my farm. Then Wandong and Heathcote Junction, I believe, are going to be, they'll be singed. They've got to go on full alert, but there's no announcement. The wind's blowing at 80 to 100 kilometres an hour. I don't know why Wandong and Heathcote Junction haven't been alerted.
Within minutes of this call, warnings are issued, but it seems the system is already being stretched. As the day unfolds, it will all but collapse. Wandong burns, and the fire moves onward and upward into the Mount Disappointment State Forest. As it rises, so too does the wind, sweeping the flames to the southeast. Nestled on the other side of the range, directly in the fire's path, is tiny Strathewen. CFA staff prepare a draft message predicting that the fire could hit various towns, including Strathewen. But the warning is not sent to the control room to be uploaded onto the CFA website. By early evening, 90 fires are raging right across the state. Towns have already been obliterated. At least 50 lives already lost. But everything is about to get worse. Much worse. Gale-force northerly winds have pushed all today's major fires to the southeast. But the wind is starting to shift direction. The southerly change begins to push the fires northeast. The effect will be devastating. The 50-kilometre flank, stretching to Strathewen and St Andrews, is now the huge new front of the fire. Many more towns are in range. At the top of the mountain, King Lake is one of the first in line. CFA staff prepare an urgent threat message for various towns, including King Lake. But the message inexplicably goes missing and never appears on their website. It's another half an hour before the warning is broadcast.
The communities of Clonbinane, Mount Disappointment, King Lake, Heathcote Junction, which is actually next to Wandong, Upper Plenty, Hume Vale, Reedy Creek and Strath Creek may be directly impacted on fire in the coming time frame.
Half of the places singled out for warnings are already on fire.
Of course, the issue of warnings, given or not given, was looked at closely by the Royal Commission into the Black Saturday fires. And months after Inside the Firestorm was broadcast, the Royal Commission handed down its findings.
The Royal Commission unearthed a shocking array of failures, the worst among them the failure to properly warn communities as fire bore down.
Missing at a time of crisis. That's the damning indictment of those in charge during Victoria's Black Saturday bushfires.
The CFA, or Country Fire Authority, had spent years telling the public that on any high-risk day, if they weren't prepared to stay and defend their home, they had to evacuate by 10 a.m. A direction described by Robert Mann in an essay in The Monthly as one of utopian impracticality. And no matter what, the CFA warned, you couldn't rely on a warning or a truck. So it seems the CFA didn't see not issuing a warning as the complete failure that others saw it to be. When Russell Rees, the CFA fire chief, said the day before Black Saturday,
"We are in almost uncharted territory." And when I say uncharted territory, there are no records that show the sort of fire conditions tomorrow predicted.
I imagine he and others in his organisation saw their role a bit like the coach of a football team. Once the siren goes, it's up to each player to do what they've been told to do. His role is to manage the trucks and his own people, but in relation to the public, he's more an observer. Or, in the words of Jack Rush, lawyer assisting the Royal Commission,
as if the senior fire personnel were powerless, behind the glass, unable or unwilling to influence or attempt to influence the tragedy that was unfolding.
6 months after the fires, the CFA chief had this to say.
Do you now accept that the CFA should have done more and that you personally should have done more to warn people?
Well, what I say is that the systems and the technologies were set up and did not cope with that day. So we had done what we thought was right, but we accept that the systems and technologies let us down. The processes that we had simply didn't cope, and we accept that. So everyone that I know of and everyone I talked to, and myself included, did everything they could on that day.
They did everything they could within a system they created and were trained in, so that everything they did within it affirmed and compounded their ideology. As Robert Mann wrote in his July 2009 essay, read here by an AI voice,
"At every level, the professionals inside the CFA, and no doubt the DSE, were imprisoned by their organisation's mind-numbing bureaucratic rules. Conformity to rules was, in turn, the enemy of judgment, common sense and moral responsibility."
18 months after the fire and 2 weeks after the Royal Commission handed down its report, Russell Rees was able to say this.
I, like others, feel in my heart that I did my very best, but I accept fully the criticisms. And if I had my time over again, there is no doubt I would have done some things differently.
This failure of emergency services to give warnings at the height of a crisis, and their reluctance to see their omission as a critical neglect, is emblematic of the detachment of modern bureaucracies and the disconnect between government and citizen. Themes we'll explore more in later episodes. The Royal Commission didn't just focus on the actions of government. It travelled to fire-affected areas to see and hear directly from people who lived through the fires.
It's been 2 months since the Victorian bushfire disaster, and today the first stage of the Royal Commission finished. The final public consultation session was held this afternoon at Strathewen, where an estimated 27 people died. Simon Lauder was there for PM.
Over the past 3 weeks, the Bushfire Royal Commission has toured the fire-affected communities holding town hall-style meetings. While the Royal Commission has moved on to the next stage, in many ways the bushfire recovery is just beginning. Today, the head of the Bushfire Appeal Fund, John Landy, announced the appeals raised $301 million.
This journalistic segue from the end of the Royal Commission to an account of the millions raised to support recovery tells us a lot about the way we approach the aftermath of disaster. Perhaps it's best described as blame and build. In our money and media-driven world, recovery is often reduced to dollars and the fences and roads, houses and halls that must be built with the money. For the most part, the power to decide how those funds are spent, what is or is not built, and when and how they're built, is held by government, layers of government, local, state and federal, and the Red Cross, and a slew of other agencies. But whether it's a school child, a community or a nation, rarely do people like having decisions imposed on them. Rarely do people thrive or recover when they lack agency. A disaster's modus operandi is loss of control. A government introducing, imposing, requiring or enforcing the rebuilding is using the same calling card. Regaining a sense of autonomy is essential for human well-being, but not just at the individual level, because a disaster is not just a bunch of individuals having a similar experience.
The definition of a disaster is that it's a threat to life and property which has a community impact. If it doesn't have a community impact, it's a tragedy, not a disaster. Most importantly, disasters are social events which damage the social system as much as they damage the physical infrastructure.
This is Dr. Rob Gordon, a clinical psychologist who's been working with communities recovering from disasters since 1983. He's talking here at the Gender Justice in Disaster online conference in 2021. To illustrate the impact on the social system, Dr. Rob, as many people in disaster-affected communities across Australia call him, uses a visual animation to show the dissolving of differences as the fire or flood or whatever disaster moves across the landscape.
Because they're about to be impacted. Nothing else is important. It doesn't matter whether they vote for Liberals and Labor or Barrack for Collingwood or St Kilda. They're all one.
While this sense of oneness is wonderful, as we'll see in the experiences of Indigenous people in the Black Summer fires, it's not universal. But even when it is widespread, ultimately it leads to
a profound sweeping aside temporarily of this social structure. People lose their connections. I call that social debonding. We debond from our social attachments, maybe just momentarily, maybe for an extended time, depending on what happens. And its reversal is not automatic. That depends on what happens next.
How a community transitions from this fusion state to a new state of social differentiation is of critical importance to recovery, and it can easily go wrong.
We get cleavages opening up between people who have different entitlements, between people who evacuated and those who stayed, between those who lost property and those who didn't, between those who are insured and those who didn't. So often we see it around those who are entitled to receive government assistance and those who didn't qualify for some reason. People are not able to process the complexity of this. And so the friendships and relationships between people that were in different sides of these splits suffers and ruptures. And we see that the way the government or other agencies give assistance, if it's not carefully thought about and designed for consideration of the social bonds in this fusion state, it severs the social bonds.
These social bonds are profoundly important to us, despite the fact that we often aren't even aware they exist until they're gone. And those pushed to the margins before a disaster, First Nations people, single parents, people on low incomes, the elderly, those with disabilities, suffer disproportionately from the impact of a disaster, enabling a poor recovery process to compound social inequalities and create future ones.
The physical disaster is not the most important thing, it's the social disruption. So people often talk about the irreversible changes that happen in this recovery period, often towards the end of the first year, the second year, the third year. This is when things start to go wrong in relationships and health and social systems, where marriages break down and relationships with children go wrong, relationships with neighbours and friends break down, sense of belonging to communities damage, and people call this the second disaster.
Dr. Rob also highlights the contribution of government and NGOs in supporting or damaging this essential dimension of recovery.
It's so important that communities are not under deadlines and don't find themselves in a material-centred recovery system.
Implicit in what Dr. Gordon is talking about is the idea that communities are a thing. We're not just individuals or families who happen to live near each other. We're connected in ways that have been downplayed to the point of invisibility for decades. And this common experience of disaster shows there's a clear and critical need to focus on the fabric of community, on civic life, for healing, for empowerment after chaos, and to address inequalities and strengthen inclusion, which are all entwined like a double helix with democracy. Which is why, even before the new shoots sprouted, Steve and others in Strathewen were reaching for different options. While that Royal Commission argued and submitted and listened, and they did listen, they were particularly attentive to the experiences of those who'd lost loved ones. While the fire authorities toured the regional towns speaking to communities shaken to the core because there but for the grace of the gale go they. While the media invaded, inspired and informed. The people of Strathewen, as individuals, families and most particularly as a community, grappled with how they were to find their way to the surface of life, how they could have agency, dignity and collectivism in the recovery process that was, after all, about them.
One of a community elder just lived just outside the fire area at the orchards, and when people were coming up and going out again, they'd drop in to catch up on the latest news and find out what was going on. So right from day one, she started collecting phone numbers and started making a map of which houses burnt down and who died where. So she had really critical information that the police end up using.
It wasn't that Strathewen wanted to become a new nation state, but they needed something different from government.
Everyone is stronger by working together, and government plays a role in that, but they need to understand their role in that. They need to bring their good stuff, their good game, not their usual game, because the usual game is about control and minimising and being counting widgets and all the terrible stuff that doesn't help communities to recover.
The belief that not only is our political system incapable of serving us well when we are impacted by a disaster, but that the actions of government and agencies may further damage us and our communities is the reason for this podcast. And as we'll see later, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, this possibility of further harm starts as soon as they set foot inside an evacuation centre.
Another driver was that we were starting to be given money as a community, and someone had been given a novelty cheque, a real cheque, but it was the big cardboard one, for $100,000 made out to the Strathewen community. They put it in their wardrobe. They were a respected community member, and we knew that it was there, and they knew that we knew it was there, and that just sent up red flags all over the place. So who's going to get this money? How do we decide who gets it? Who's going to make that decision? There is no answer to any of those. All the answers to those are bad.
So this small group of community leaders in Strathewen talked amongst themselves.
We, the small group, we didn't even have a name, realised that we had no authority to speak on behalf of our community, no authority to spend money, no authority to do anything. And if we did anything, it'd be awful. There was no good to come out of any of that.
I am still a little in awe of this decision by the good folks of Strathewen. It seems to me that the first, easiest and instinctive step would be to move into the breach and make decisions about where and how the money could be used in the immediacy of the moment. It's the most usual path of government and other agencies. Later we can take more time and decide properly, but for now we just have to give it our best guess because that's what's needed. So initially I thought Strathewen must be extraordinary in some way. But now I think Strathewen has what many communities have, people with strong democratic values guiding their actions.
And so we started thinking about we need a group that is authorised to make decisions. That needs to be formal. We need an incorporated association with a proper charter and positions and such things. All right, that's a really good start. So let's go to a community meeting. Let's call the community together and propose this idea. Same woman had been building a house and it was half finished. So it was the outside and the roof, but no internal walls. And so she offered it as our community meeting place because everything else had gone. The hall had burnt down, the fire station, the school. You're a rat bag. So that was the White House, and it was a White House. It became the local catch-up centre and eventually became a relief centre. We met there. We proposed to community because we had a mailing list. We were able to send. She also worked with Telstra to organise an SMS system so she could dial one number and it sent out an SMS message to 100 phones. And it would have cost a fortune. And we had no money at that stage. As a Landkey group, we bought barbecue and tables and chairs and set them up. And she was providing every Sunday there'd be a barbecue in the afternoon. So when people came up to fiddle around their properties, they could go back, stop at the White House, have a wash, have a sausage, bit of bread, have a chat, catch up with people, see how everyone's doing, and go home again. Not home again. Go to the other home again.
The thing to notice here, and something I've heard often from people who've thought about recovery issues a lot, is that every community is different. Now, like me, you might think, yeah, of course, every community is different, and then proceed to develop an opinion about how the recovery should be done without any real idea of the character or chemistry of any given community. We live in the era of big bureaucracy, and what big bureaucracies and corporations don't do well or at all is cater to differences. Their strength and capacity is in systems that apply the same way to everyone, whether it works for them or not. Hospital is a classic example. Everything from meals to treatment to sleep is arranged so the system can treat people in bulk, even when this is not the best healing regime for any single person. No other community will have a half-built White House just outside the fire zone.
So we met there, unanimous decision to form a community association. All right, that's terrific. Who would like to be involved in the formation of that association? We're thinking, and 32 hands went up. All right, no good community's ever had 32 people on it. All right, okay, let's have our first meeting of the 32 at the White House one night. Talked about things, and I think a lot of people were there just to make sure that bad stuff didn't happen, that these people didn't take over and just run things. How about we form a very small group to develop the concept of an association and draft the purposes and structure, and then we'll bring that back to you. So we did that. So I chaired that little group and we had about 5 or 6 people that met at someone else's place that hadn't burnt down, and over a couple of weeks chewed out an idea for an association, what its purposes were, and sort of gradually whittled them down to being deliberately about disaster recovery. It's not about, we didn't want it to be the Strathewen Progress Association or anything like that. It was about recovery from this bushfire to assist people and do things for our community. And we cleverly put a sunset clause on it that this would exist for 3 years.
So the Strathewen community set about creating a democratic organisation so they'd have a better chance at having a voice and a seat at the table in the recovery. Let's zoom out for a moment and take a brief look at democracy in the abstract, what it gives us and what it needs from us. The biggest thing democracy gives us is peace, in the war and peace sense of things. Democracy enables us to resolve collective issues without resorting to violence. Democratic nations are, on the whole, more peaceful with other nations, less likely to engage in conduct that leads to war. They're more likely to adhere to international law and take actions to protect the environment. The other thing we get from democracy is personal freedom, because democracies are based on the principle of equality, so everyone has an equal right to live the way they want, so far as their actions don't impinge on others, which includes the earth being the source of life for everyone. So for democracy to flourish, we need to foster equality. Equality before the law, one person, one vote, and equal rights. And while it's probably impossible to create a society that is fully equal, we need our society to bend towards equality of wealth, power, education and opportunity, rather than towards class, strata and hierarchy. Democracy might be slower than dictatorial methods, but overall, democracies are more peaceful, more stable, and they offer much in the way of personal freedoms. It turns out Steve and the people of Strathewen are not the only ones uneasy about our political and bureaucratic institutions and processes. The 2023 Trust and Satisfaction with Australian Democracy National Survey found that roughly half the respondents aren't sure democracy in Australia is progressing in the right direction. Deeply troubling is the finding that 49% believe that corruption is a widespread issue in Australia's democratic institutions and processes. This crisis of faith in democracy exists in countries across the globe, and the political scientists, philosophers and commentators are worried.
The world is experiencing a wave of democratic erosion.
This is Professor Susan Stokes from the University of Chicago, speaking in an online lecture to the Kiev School of Economics in September 2022.
Democratic erosion or democratic backsliding. And this is basically when presidents or prime ministers come to office through free and fair elections and then usually pretty quickly start undermining the very institutions of democracy which have brought them to power.
And according to Professor Stokes and other political scientists, a key factor leading to the democratic erosion or backsliding in many, but not all countries, is income and wealth inequality, which has been steadily increasing in Australia and many other countries for the last 40 years. She argues that what we're seeing is
a model that goes from income inequality under democracy to populism and to democratic erosion. Income inequality creates discord in the electorate, a sense of resentment of having been left behind by economic growth. Among the elite, there is resistance to heavily redistributive measures, which are costly to them. The situation opens up space for right-wing populists, political leaders who play to the constituent sense of resentment for having been left behind. But these populist leaders translate this resentment not into a redistributive agenda, but into a non-class idiom of polarization around other cleavages other than social class. So contemporary political theorists identify populism with political parties and movements that deploy a rhetoric and extol a political worldview that combines anti-elitism and a kind of worldview in which the world is divided into forces of good and evil. So it's not so much a politics of policy debates, of differences over public policy. It's a politics of identities and forces that represent sort of absolute good and absolute evil.
This good versus evil, rather than policy-based politics, inevitably leads to increased polarisation, which correlates with democratic erosion.
So other things being equal, the more polarised voters are, citizens are, the more they are willing to give up on the niceties of democracy in order to keep the bad guys out of power.
Professor Stokes and other researchers have graphed a clear causal link between income and wealth inequality and democratic erosion in the 21st century.
In unequal countries, as income rises, the probability of erosion grows substantially.
In later episodes, we'll look in more detail at the issue of income and wealth inequality. Safe to say here that it's real, it's been growing steadily, And in addition to its role in undermining democracy, it negatively impacts nearly every social well-being marker for all levels of a society. All this might seem like a far cry from a small community in rural Australia, but unless we're aware of the tendency of inequality to lead to democratic erosion, we're like frogs in the democratic pot on the stove, unaware of changes in temperature until it's way too late. And one, if not the culprit in the widening gap between rich and poor, is the rise of neoliberalism from the early 1980s, which curiously coincides with the time many consider to be the beginning of the modern response to disaster recovery in Australia, when communities across Victoria and South Australia were devastated by the Ash Wednesday bushfires of 1983. Next episode on Democracy After Disaster, we'll explore the experiences 20 years before I moved there of my hometown, the forest and mountains of Macedon, and the reverberations of both the fire and the recovery that still echo today.
Because everything was in Gisborne. If they wanted a teaspoon, if they wanted sanitary pads, whatever they wanted was all in Gisborne. And I said, but the people are here. They want to stay here.
Democracy After Disaster is written, produced and hosted by me, Kate Lawrence from Story Ground. This podcast was made on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to ancestors and elders and thank them for their careful and sacred use of fire in this landscape and their inspiring sense of community. This project is auspiced by Highlands FM community radio station and supported by a grant from the National Australia Bank. If you like this podcast, please rate and review it wherever you listen, and most importantly, tell your colleagues, friends and family. And if you have any comments, questions or feedback, please email me, kate@storyground.com.au. Thanks for listening.